to see people joining the call, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to a great discussion. Data is such a hot topic at the moment. So I'm actually coming to you all from Ngunnawal land in Canberra today. I am in the nation's capital for the Community Housing Conference, Power Housing Australia, which is fantastic. It's been a great morning. Where are you guys? You in the Hunter, Sarah?
Yeah, I'm in Wanneroo land in the Hunter, in the cocoon, which is the Wanneroo word for the Hunter Valley. And I like to hide in the Hunter Valley and I work nationally and New Zealand, so I'm never where I'm meant to be. So I might as well be somewhere else. That's lovely. Is the theory that I'm going with.
No, I completely feel that. Where are you, Michael?
Set up in the Sydney office of George Street.
Gotta go land.
Yeah.
Well, we're just going to give everybody a few minutes to kick off and join in. I have been thrashing my laptop this morning. I then managed to lose my hotel room key. So I've had one of those mornings. So I'm really hoping my 31% battery power lasts the entire webinar.
My waiting. Mike and I were working on a project together with intense deadlines. So
oh, right, okay.
Tapping away in the background while we're waiting. So that's
cool. Well, I'll just give everyone another minute or so to come on board. We're getting a good number coming on, which is great to see. And we are recording this too, so we will be putting it onto the brand new Proptech Association YouTube channel. So we finally joined, 2005. But we do now have a YouTube channel where we've put all of we've uploaded or created lists of all of our Proptech panels and video content so far, including your session, Sarah, from the Proptech forum, which was fantastic.
Sarah, heavy website.
Hey guys, well look, we might kick off and get started. Welcome to everybody who is joining us on the call. My name is Kylie Davis. I am the president of the Proptech Association Australia, and it is absolutely fantastic to see you here today. This is our very first Tech Spotlight, where we are highlighting an issue that we're facing as an industry and having a deep dive conversation between two experts in the field. Before I kick off, I would like to do an acknowledgement of country. I am coming to you today from Ngunnawal land in Canberra. I'm here for the Power Housing Australia Community Housing Conference, so it's great to be here in the nation's capital. But we extend our welcome to leaders past, present and emerging, and so and thanks to everybody who's joining us here today. So our Proptech Spotlight is this deep dive into the conversation around data democratisation, complete mental breakdown on how to put that word together, and we're joined by Michael Ogilvie from Data Army and Dr. Sarah Bell, who is now one of Australia's leading foremost experts on AI from CoreLogic. So I'm going to hand over to both of you, Michael, to kick off. I better give you presenting rights, right? There we go. That's nailing this technology. So thank you so much, and take it away. Looking forward to the conversations.
Thanks very much, Kylie. Can everyone see my screen okay? Thumbs up, I'm assuming. Cool. Okay, let's get started. So thanks for the introduction, and I appreciate everyone for dialing in. I know it's the end of the year, it's quite a busy time, and it might be lunchtime for some people as well. So I appreciate you taking the time to dial in. This is quite a large topic on data democratisation, but we're going to do our best just to cover the main points and hopefully drive some discussion towards the end of the session. We'll go through what is data democratisation and try and give it some sort of definition. Why does data democratisation even need to be considered? Like, why does it matter? And what are some of the barriers or blockers that prevent businesses today from becoming more data-driven? Then we'll talk through some of the strategies and approaches that we have seen work and some that don't work so well. And then finally, we'll talk about how Data Army is helping tackle the data democratization within the Proptech ecosystem by introducing the Proptech Cloud. We'll have a question time towards the end, but if anyone's got anything pertinent to a particular slide, please raise a hand or something and we'll try to address it as we go through.
Yeah, we'll ask people to pop comments in the chat or the Q&A, and Michael and I'll keep an eye on them for you.
Perfect, thanks very much. So just do an introduction again. So Dr. Sarah is the Principal for Innovation Industry at CoreLogic. For those who aren't aware of CoreLogic, they've been at the forefront of sort of innovation in PropTech for the last 40 plus years in Australia. You may have known them by their former name as RP Data. They also have a global presence with the US, UK, I think there's a lot more in New Zealand. There's more, I can't cover them all off. I'm the director of Data Army. So Data Army is a data consultancy that offers data engineering and analytics services. Myself and Data Army have been working with CoreLogic since about 2014 or so. So I've been working together quite closely for a long period of time. We know each other quite well, and hence why we're presenting here today. So I'm going to start with coming up with trying to give a definition to what data democratization is. So a simple definition might be the process of making data and information accessible to a broader range of users, not just limited to a select few. So it's a simple definition, but there's a pretty loaded word in there, which is pretty subjective, and that's accessible. So what does accessible mean? It's going to mean different things to different people. If you're a data analyst or a data scientist, and you've got a lot of development experience and you're working with AI models, etc., all day, it's going to mean something different to you versus someone from marketing or HR, sales, or somebody that's not working with data that often and don't have the university degree around data. So people are approaching data with like different backgrounds and different skill sets, and they're not always going to see accessibility the same way. There's one example I like to talk to, like around like how some people might see accessibility differently. I'm sure everyone's aware of open data concepts within governments. In Australia, we have them at the federal and state levels and even council levels. They've got the data.gov.au's, etc. So their objective was around making public record data accessible to the public for consumption. So it's a data democratization effort. But the data there is tens of thousands of data sets. If anyone's going to take a look, they come in all different formats. You have CSVs, Excels, XMLs, JSON, spatial files, APIs, lots of different formats. The metadata is fairly limited there about what you can get on those data sets. And the quality can be quite varied. Some data is really old, some's quite new, some's updated, some is not. So if you're a data analyst, you're going to love those sort of portals, and it's a playground. There's lots of data, you can consume it. If you're somebody that doesn't come from a technical background, that's going to seem like a bit of a nightmare. You're going to get lost. You're not going to find where most things are. It's not categorized or labeled particularly well. So one interpretation is accessible, one interpretation that is not accessible. So if we're trying to have an objective in data democratization to make it accessible for the majority of people or for more people, not just technical, could we say that those open portals really are accessible? Some would argue yes, some would argue no. I'll probably argue to no. They're difficult to consume from. Another thing this definition doesn't address is security and privacy. So we want to make data accessible, but not all data should be accessible. And personal identifiable information doesn't need to exist in data, in most cases, to get use out of it. So I think let's give it a slightly different definition and say data democratization is a process of making compliant data accessible to non-specialists without requiring them to have expertise in data analysis or data science. Oh, sorry, apologies. So with this definition, we have some restrictions in place. So we use the word compliant, which qualifies the data access. So now that infers that we need to have some sort of control mechanisms in place. And this is an important part of data democratization and data governance as a whole. And we also have a clear objective, or it's a clearer objective, and that's we want to have greater access to more people, not just the specialists. So not everybody, but more people, and focusing on non-expert users. Sarah, maybe you want to talk to this particular slide and look at these like pillars of data democratization.
Yeah, I think, thanks, Michael. I think that's a really good kind of throw to, because it is easy to sort of say, you know, we're going to make all this data accessible, and access to data is, you know, this kind of unbridled access to data is more kind of equivocal with the notion of data anarchy. And that's certainly not what it's about. It's, you know, and the moral panic associated with having PII flying all around the cloud. No one's here for that. But data democracy is, I think, much more about enabling everyday person to be empowered to use and understand data. And you know, for me, I guess one of my main kind of platform pieces is that data is story. Data in the 21st century is how we actually create meaning about the work we do, the world around us. And knowledge is power, right? And having insights and intelligence about the work we do, the government that we work with, and all of these kind of different areas enables us to have power over those things and to interact with them from an informed and powerful point of view. And so true data democracy, as Michael was sort of saying, isn't really just about, you know, kind of opening the curtains and letting people come into the data shop. It has to be coupled with three really important things. And the first one is understanding. And that's addressing, you know, those barriers to use, those educational barriers to use, so that every person can kind of make their own meaning from the stories and the data that they're accessing. And to do that, you have to have a certain level of education, or the data that you're being presented with should be, you know, analyst vetted before you're kind of given this, you know, nonsensical data. So understanding is a really important pillar of data democratization, as is the tools. So in order to actually reach, you know, kind of access in its broadest sense, access to process, to, you know, segment, to apply, to do any of the kind of, you know, data gymnastics that you want to do with it, we need democratic tools as well. And the progress of all technology has become more democratic. You know, WordPress making websites democratic. You can literally just drag and drop kind of bundles, and that was the tooling that made accessibility possible for new technology. And so data tooling, you know, that allows everybody without a data science degree or Michael's big brain to work with data and make meaning according, you know, to their appropriate level of understanding and knowledge is also super important. And then culture plays another really important part of data democratization. So even if you've got access to data at your workplace to use, if you have a highly prohibitive, highly risk-averse, restrictive culture, you might not want to use it, or you might feel like you know, if you're not technical, you're not strictly a data scientist, that you might not want to access it because of the risks and the fallout of that. And kind of the analogy that I use to explain the cultural piece is, you know, there was a period kind of in the early 2000s where workplaces spent a lot of money to put gyms in the office. But then if anybody was at the gym, there would be this kind of like, oh God, they're at the gym, they're not working sort of view. So no one used the gym. And that's why, because they didn't want to have the stigma of not working. And so that's why the cultural piece is really important, because you want people to be supported to use the data safely. And all of these three pillars kind of make up that access framework in my opinion.
Okay, so let's look at why data accessibility is an issue. Why is it a thing? Why do we care about data access? And to do that, we're going to look at some of the driving forces forcing us to consider this. So the first one being rapid technology changes. Technology is changing absolutely everywhere, faster and faster each year, each decade, and nowhere more so than AI and ML. So AI has huge power. I think everyone's sort of aware of that and nearly endless potential, but it needs to be properly understood to make the most use out of it. And without sort of a detailed understanding of a new technology, particularly AI and ML, it can cause more harm than good. I'm not sure how many of you might have seen like Black Mirror on Netflix. It's a good example of how technology adoption can go wrong. From my point of view, the reason why that show is quite good actually is I don't think it's too far removed from reality. Everything's sort of plausible in those shows. So potential technology adoption issues such as bias in AI, somewhat mitigated with the addition of more information about how the technology was created and where it came from. So in the AI context, that might be information about like where the data was sourced to train the models, what algorithms were used, who wrote them, like what country were those people from, what socioeconomic background did they come from. So there's a lot of factors that can influence how that model performs, particularly even like who gives feedback. So there's natural things that can influence results. And if people aren't aware of those influencing factors, you can't really make informed business decisions about whether or not you should be using them without sort of taking some sort of significant risk. And I think there's plenty of businesses that will take that risk, but I think we're still learning what some of the pitfalls of that are going to be. The next one I want to dig into is the digital divide, and I'm going to focus more on the commercial aspect, both within business and across industry. There's a deeper human aspect, and Sarah, you might touch on this as well. But I'm just going to look at the commercial side for now. So within an organization, I see it as you have two types of people. It's those with data access and information, and those that don't have it. Typically in my job, because of what I sort of do, I'm in the camp of having access. So it's pretty good for me, not so good for others. So how we typically see it play out is the people and teams that have access usually have the burden of supporting those that don't have access. So this transpires in that usually they're supporting these other teams or supporting the business in general. The demand is greater than the supply, just because of resourcing and investment, and a backlog starts to build up. So this team's clamoring constantly to try and unlock this data and help people out in understanding, and then they just never catch up. And in the other camp, the people that don't have access and don't have data are constantly waiting, and they're waiting for these central teams or teams like people to help them out and make data and information available to them. So then they either go into a pause phase and waiting, or they start making decisions without the data required. Neither scenario is particularly good. So the cost of business then is usually like you've got delayed product launches or feature releases. Your analysis comes out inaccurate, poor business decisions overall. And if we look at it like at an industry level for this digital divide, I think one of the things that's going to potentially come out of that is the anti-competition scenarios. And I think we all have seen it play out lots of times in history. Generally, competition is good in industry. I think no one's going to debate that. Whenever you have a few large organizations having all the control, generally doesn't work out good for consumers or the public of those businesses or those industries. So in the Proptech space, I believe like data is control. So the greater access we have to data and information across the industry, the healthier industry we're going to have for everybody. It's going to be a more level playing field. And with a more level playing field, we're going to have greater problem solving and better innovation across the industry.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point, Michael. I'll just jump in on kind of the human stuff there. You know, the kind of the situation that you're describing, the kind of data oligarchy where things are concentrated. Unless there is balance, the communicative balance and ownership balance in that data flow, then, you know, the nature of the power centers that creates opens up for, in its most perverse form, exploitation, and in, I guess, its kind of most meek form, this limitation of vulnerability, or this potential of vulnerability here. And I think digital data democratization is kind of at the frontier of the data economy, and we're all kind of adjusting to that, and it will take a long time, I think, before we follow the money and kind of really balance that. But we can take clues from sort of digital democratization, which is slightly, kind of got its footprint ahead of data democratization. And it's, I often think about the digital by default policies that governments have brought in, and kind of the impacts they've had. And we know why. We know why they do it. They save, I think there's a McKinsey report that says that Australia saves $1 trillion annually on digital by default policy. So that means when you call up, the government, you get the phone robot, and then you get directed to websites, and it's that's the experience that is kind of grounded in economic rationalism. But what we know from lots of research is that that has a significant impact on vulnerable populations. And it's interesting to kind of talk about, while we're talking about data democratization, that there's still 2.5 million Australians, 10% of our population, that are not online, that remain offline. And so, in the digital space, that impacts access to, digital by default government. But in terms of, that power balance that you're talking about, the frustration that exists between not having access to the information you need to make informed decisions as an adult with human agency, becomes really frustrating, and forces people into a structural vulnerability that they have no means of overcoming. And as you said, there is another side to it, and that is the burden of outreach, the burden of, I guess, navigating or harboring this population that we're kind of, in a way, structurally defeating. So we kind of create this disenfranchised mass market of people. We're talking about a very kind of privileged group of people that have the capabilities and the education and the opportunity to work with data. So we've created this mass market of disenfranchised people and put the burden on very, very few to do that heavy lifting before I think that tooling is really available for that mass market. So it's an interesting point in history, and I think a lot of people feel this weird sense of being othered by not having access to the data. So yeah, that's kind of my human comments on the digital divide.
Thank you. Perfect. So these next three issues, I sort of see they feed each other. So we're talking, it starts with trust, and trust in the data and its accuracy and reliability. And when you don't have trust, you end up having inaccurate or gut feel sort of decisions, and those decisions can be poor and lead to negative business outcomes. That sort of poor decisions then sort of stifles your growth as a business, and that stifled growth then reduces funding, which goes back into data democratization and understanding better, which then leads to more trust erosion, and it's this downward spiral. So I think largely trying to start with making data accessible to everybody, building that trust, it stops that ripple effect of this downward spiral between poor decisions, less money, worse data continuing.
Yeah, it's interesting because that link between trust and adoption is empirical, so we can't underestimate the value of trust. But I think that the story from the literature in this is that an investment not in the humans that are accessing this, as well as the tooling and the data itself, is worth it. So Borowecki did a 2021 study in the Netherlands and was able to kind of empirically prove a significant correlations between labour productivity and multi-factor productivity, where there was an investment both in information systems, data and humans in order to access it. And so I think when there's a lesson there in adoption and implementation, for this is when you have your budget for your tool, you have your budget for your data, and that's how I see data. I see like the tool and the software is the car and the data is the petrol, right? So, but if you're not investing in skilled drivers, you're going to have a fueled up Ferrari that sits in the garage, and I think that is really evident in the science and the literature in this field, that shows that you should always have a budget for the human actors that are involved in your data projects.
Yeah, definitely. I think we've got some good charts coming up there talking to those exact same points. So what are some of the barriers and blockers that can hamper data democratization and access to data? So we're going to look at it from the internal aspect, internal to organization, and then external as well. So what we sort of witness in a typical setup within a business is that traditionally the data sits in some sort of database or databases somewhere. There's security and access controls blocking access. And if it's a large organization, the data is usually spread over a huge amount of infrastructure. The data is usually, arranged in some sort of way that very few people know or understand. It's usually being transformed or massaged in some way, but not many people know how. The documentation sort of fragmented or non-existent. There'll be jargon all through there that no one understands. And potentially the people or the team that built it may no longer be in the business. So it creates a sort of perfect storm where trying to get access to data generally doesn't lead to very much. You may get access, and that often happens. People do get access, but you don't have all the information that goes along with it. You don't have the context, you don't have the documentation, you don't know how it was built. So that access, whilst at a surface level you have access, it's not true access because you don't know what to do with it. You're not empowered to do anything more on it.
I think sometimes there's a risk as well with the internal challenges, is not a lack of data governance or security, but potentially over enthusiastic data governance and security. And so by you can go through too much of an onerous process by risk-averse leadership that by the time you actually have access to the data, you don't need it anymore. Or or the problem solved itself some other way. So it's a two-sided coin there. There's a real baby bear's porridge at the right temperature kind of sweet spot that we need to find.
Yeah, there's definitely a balancing that needs to be done. The external challenges are sort of a little bit more broad. So data privacy regulations are ever evolving, probably not fast enough, but they're still evolving along with technology. So businesses tend to stick with caution rather than sort of collaboration when working with partners. So that can slow things down. Intellectual property rights, they're a big concern, and they should be, because the traditional way of exchanging data often is via files. Some people are still sending files over emails. And what happens to those files after they're gone, no one really knows, and that's a concern. So often that's a blocker for a lot of businesses. The next point, which is true of any industry, but particularly in the Proptech as well, there's a lack of standards, and this can inhibit the understanding of data. So standard in terminology and also standard way to represent data both seem missing, and the result is usually a lot of time spent sort of interpreting data and from its various sources. Access can be extremely costly because, again, most people are sending files or APIs, which is great, but generally you got to remember there's got to be somebody at the other end to process that, and those human resources come at a cost. So that access thing, whilst it's the data itself, but it's also the services involved in getting that data loaded. Security concerns are also growing quite rapidly. Cybersecurity threats anyway, adopting the same sort of AI and ML structures that everybody else is using. So the threats are growing and they're much faster. I'm still waiting for a deep fake to come out for me with grey hair and stocky little guy. Awareness of data assets is also an industry problem that we observe. People just aren't aware of what's available, where to find it, the data quality, who are the providers. Do you see any other external challenges, Sarah?
Yeah, I was going to just say, I think when we look at the regulatory environment, quite often we say, oh, it's restrictive. But when you're innovating and when you're working on novel cases and stuff, the problem with the regulation isn't that it's regulatory. The problem with the regulation is that it's silent. And so it's very difficult quite often to go, well, here's what I want to do with the data. Is that okay? And it's not the job or the function of regulators to be permissive and say, yes, you can do that. It's actually their job to be prohibitive and say, oh, no, you can't do that. And so it's very difficult, without kind of model rules and guidelines and things like that are very, very well adopted and understood, almost democratically, you might argue, that it's difficult to kind of go forward with confidence in relation to these external regulations when they simply don't exist yet. And what do? Do you absorb the risk? Do you create a little war chest for your fines if they come up? If the legislation does roll in and it is prohibitive, but it wasn't at the time that you started, like how navigating that ambiguity of the new data economy without, I think, enough permissive or model rules for innovation can be quite tricky.
Mm-hmm.
We'll figure it out.
Yeah. Okay, so next we want to touch on some strategies and approaches that we've witnessed work and some that don't work so well. But I wanted to start with looking at some statistics that I think tell a story. I think it touches on earlier about your investment in people. So the first one is around the share of firms worldwide with measurable business value from data analytics investments. So you can see it's growing quite rapidly, and the vast majority, almost 92% of businesses are getting return on investment for their data and analytics. So there's benefit there. And this next slide shows the size of the data analytics market and the ecosystem supporting data analytics. And we can see that it's growing quite rapidly, sort of at the 300 billion mark at the moment and growing quite quickly. So supply would indicate that there's demand, and we're seeing that the demand is getting sort of 90%, 92% return on their investment. But then we start looking at the learning and development programs that are getting deployed. And there's some interesting things here. So we spoke about some of the pitfalls of particularly AI and ML about understanding bias, and we're not seeing a huge amount of investment there, but there is investment, so there's something. And digital fluency or transformation programs and data analysis and data analytics. So not a massive amounts of organizations, still like 3/4 are not investing in these areas, even though we're seeing that it's growing and then we're seeing that most businesses are getting a return on that. And then I think this particular statistic is a good one because it shows most businesses, close to half of them are seeing data as a business asset. A lot of them are driving innovation with data, like close to 2/3 there, and a lot of them are competing on data analytics. But then when we look at the data culture, it's not particularly high. Only 20% of businesses are reporting they've got an established data culture. And we're looking at sort of 24% that are creating a data-driven organization. So I think that touches back on what you're saying earlier, Sarah, about the investment in people and people being at the core of a lot of these strategies. And like these statistics will sort of indicate that that's not getting reflected currently. It seems like there's still more investment in tools and less so in people.
Yeah, I think so. And look, and it's quite interesting when we go back to that trust argument, what value do the tools have if the output of the tools, the output of the data is going to be disregarded by humans who don't understand it. And then when you overlay onto that the complexity of this the data by default cultures. So, or we can't have a business case without data, but we don't really trust the data. It's like, how can you make business decisions? And there's this kind of crumple zone, I think, between having to kind of execute the work with data, but kind of this agreed collective mistrust of it that we're sort of going to ignore. It's a very awkward and unstable foundation on which to make decisions. And I think, I would like stress the requirement that people have a choice and have informed agency in relation to data. And even if you're never going to, kind of, be in the thick of a pivot table, like if that's never going to be your outcome, you should still at least have literacy about how it was created, so that the trust is there to kind of make a judgment and act on the insights. And I think that, if we can preserve literacy and empower humans to make judgment, that is the essence of democratization. But kind of, the last thing I want to see in a data-driven world is where humans become dependent on systems that they don't have the ability to interpret or understand. They just have to choose between trust and distrust from a particularly uninformed standpoint. And so, that investment in literacy, and some of that's, I think there's a self-burden to become more educated and more interested. But I think that is the crux of the investment that's needed, just basic literacy and interpretation for everyone, and then broadening the specific privilege of data science for those who want and need it.
Yeah, you touched on there the burden of people who also want to, and it's interesting looking at the country breakdown of like the people with interest in sort of upskilling in these areas, and you can see Australia, New Zealand, like whilst not right down the bottom of the pack, still there's a huge number of people that aren't interested in upskilling currently, but maybe they just haven't been communicated the benefits of having a deeper understanding, and maybe there's some reasons for that too.
Yeah, not interested, but still very much impacted.
Yes, definitely, but maybe not aware of what the impact is.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we're getting to some of the strategy things that we think don't work too well, and things that we've sort of observed. And we touched on this right at the start. And I think the objective for data democratization is really about the liberation of data in a controlled sense, but it's not about restriction. And it seems like a small change in wording, but I think it's an important one, that like the intent should always be around data use, not data restriction. And I think, Sarah, you touched on that earlier, I think it's often flipped, and in the interpretation of data democratization is immediately to lock everything down. And there's a cultural impact of that, of everyone straight away thinks that that's something that's not within their reach. I see another issue being that this data democratization efforts are often led by technology teams, and tools are a big component. We touched on it as one of those three pillars there, but I don't believe that the driving force should be coming from technology. I think it needs to come from the business in building that culture. People generally, well, my own personal opinion, I don't think technology drives culture. It can have a say in it, but I don't think they're a driving force. The next one is too much reliance on software. Tools are an important component, but they aren't your solution. You cannot buy a SaaS tool off the shelf and you have data democratization. There's still a huge people component that needs to be considered. Insufficient funding, and I think this is coming off the back of maybe insufficient value attribution. So decisions are being made based on data or insights generated from the business, but I think maybe some of the windfalls of those decisions aren't coming back to the fact that data was made available. So it's not getting back into people. Training we touched on. So not investing enough in training, that's what goes on to the point above. And I think this next point here around failing to define clear objectives, I think that ties into the point one. I know when we look at like enterprise risk plans, often you say, what's the company's risk profile? It's a clear objective, and it's a simple thing of this high, medium, low, but straight away it's telling everybody where you stand on it. So I think that same sort of thing doesn't tend to flow through most organizations that implement a strategy. And the last point there around failing to update and maintain data systems and losing trust, it's a really tricky one. It depends on the nature of the businesses and how much data they're working with. It can take a lot of effort sometimes, and it depends on where the data is coming from and what sort of information's being made available about how it originated. But if it's not kept up to date, the trust erodes and it becomes almost useless to the organization.
Yeah, look, I think I guess a lot of the time we've been talking about like buying data or external data, but I think some of this kind of what I see is people just not taking stock of the data that they have. Particularly, so I work mainly with residential real estate customers, and I feel sometimes like everyone is making money off their data but them. And and you see, you've got portals and lots of Proptechs and so many different kind of niche Proptechs making money off it. Franchisors, if you're running a franchise business, they've got access to your data and they're selling it. I don't think that trickles down. And so you've got this kind of I talked about data oligarchs before, these people that have the capability to realize value, and then people that don't know what they've got giving that value away because they lack the understanding and the tooling to have a benefits realization of the data asset that they own. And so, insufficient value attribution to that. I think it starts at home. And if you look around your business, you will have intelligence fractured everywhere in data and story that can be brought together for value. But, we don't know how to do it, or the tech team doesn't understand our marketing data, or whatever it is. And so I think, that cultural aspect and being business-led and solution-led rather than kind of pivot table-led, like software technically led, is important, because data without meaning shouldn't have a value, right? It should have a clear objective, as you very, very rightly said.
So these are some of the points that I see are important in a strategy. It's not a comprehensive list, but I think it's a good starting point. And I touched on where I think it doesn't work so well, which is being technology-led. In my opinion, I think it needs to start from the top. So you need executive buy-in about the benefit of data-based decisions or data-driven decisions within an organization, and that needs to be communicated clearly. And I think that then flows on to cultural change. If you have pushing down from the top, everyone buying into this approach, and again, the strategy of making data available with controls rather than keeping data restricted first. But then I think the next thing I would be putting in place would be feedback mechanisms. And if you look at retail businesses and businesses that interact with customers, they'll measure almost everything. And I think that's true of an organization needs to do the same thing as well. You can make data available, but how usable is it? You need to be able to measure it in some way. You can't make decisions unless you sort of have some sort of metrics driving those decisions. The data governance and security, I put it lower in importance, but it's still absolutely critical, because there's no point making data available and then paying a lot of fines for breaches of data privacy rules, etc. So you need the controls in place. And it needs to be given due respect and acknowledgement in your strategy, but it just can't be, in my opinion, it can't be the center of your strategy. The next one's the data literacy programs. This is something I'm particularly passionate about, because I think it's something that it definitely isn't static. So whilst you might have a data literate business, your staff are constantly changing. So you might be data literate 1 year and the next year not so data literate. So it's a constant investment in training and bringing people up to speed with everything.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point that, because I'm kind of on the AI side of the fence, but and there's so many conversations about AI and GPT and all the rest of it, and people forget the connection between data and the tools that they're using. And like I said, I feel like the conversation in technology is dominated by tooling, as opposed to the inputs and outputs of those tools, and how it's business led, and the data literacy kind of, I think as well, brings some accountability to the quality of the tooling. And so it's a coupled, you should always have like a coupled strategy, like right ingredients, which is your data, right methodology, which is your engineering, and right equipment, which is the software tooling. But the pillar that I see most neglected is the data literacy, because we kind of take it for granted, or worse, we think it's commoditized. Like it doesn't really matter. Like data's data. It doesn't, it doesn't matter who we get it from, or we'll use this bit of data or this bit, and then down the workflow we'll grab it from here because it's cheaper, and you'll lose the lineage or the consistency of measurement across your work process, or whatever your service design is. And so, I think kind of data shouldn't be an island in a business, because it is the fuel, it is the oceans between all of the different functions that are going on. So, I'd love to see much more literacy, but a much more holistic approach to data literacy and how it is interrelated and interconnected, to all kind of biz ops.
Yeah, I think there's consistency across the industry on that as well, because businesses don't work in silos; they usually work part of an ecosystem. So sharing terminology and having that commonality is going to go a long way, I think, to helping. So data accessibility, which I think we're just touching on the tools there, and we sort of, again, tools are important and they need to be focused on, they need to have focus in their strategy, but they're not the focus point. Like it just needs to be around people and process, and then how the tools support that. Data quality is really touching on that trust point, and it can be a particularly difficult one. Similar to the training, data quality is constantly evolving. The data is moving, how much data is captured, and the frequency that is captured is constantly changing. So it's not a static thing, and I think a lot of businesses now are investing in data quality management teams. I think that's a good idea. I think that's something that needs to grow. Awareness of the compliance and ethical considerations. It's almost like a no-brainer. You have to do this now, because without that, you're generally going to find yourself in some pretty severe data breaches. I think the last point there is just around monitoring and continuous improvement. So we touched on the previous one, taking measurements of the effectiveness of your strategy. That needs to be followed up with improvements. So whether that's shutting down data assets that aren't being used, or reports that aren't being used, whether it's training people more effectively, working out the attribution for decisions that were positive or decisions that were negative based on data, and feeding that back into improvements.
Yeah, sorry. The ethical one's really important, and there's a brilliant woman working in this field at UTS in Sydney called Nicole Vincent, and she often throws out this challenge of your ethical regulations are not just stuff I shouldn't do, that's bad. What if you, as a differentiator, made ethics the kind of the ceiling to reach for, not the floor of what you shouldn't transgress. And right at the beginning, you said, there is so much value in data that doesn't kind of involve PII information, or and there's so much you can do with data through encryption appliances and things like that when it is PII. So I don't know, I kind of joined Nicole in her challenge. What if you wanted ethical, what if you just wanted to create a new benchmark for what ethical data is, and what if that was the story that your organization was telling and could tell, and I think a lot of people, would inform people in particular would be wanting to choose that, and I think to be future facing, we need to be thinking about all of the time, because it is largely unregulated, and what is kind of ethical, I think people are part of the democratization. It's not a movement just in data, it's a movement in the whole digital world, this democratization and kind of, data sovereignty of the individual, I think we need to start thinking about and preparing for, this world where individuals have much greater control over the reach of their data. So, yeah, I think we should be engineering for strong ethics, not around it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's where it starts. I think the strategy of having accessibility is number one. Like, how do we make it accessible? And then we know we have controls, so put the controls in place. But I think often it starts with the controls, and then we'll work out later how we make it accessible. And that slight variance, I think, is why a lot of it sort of stagnates and we don't have accessibility.
Yeah.
So we sort of cover off what the data army is doing with the Proptech cloud to try and help the whole Proptech ecosystem with this data democratization problem. So the Proptech cloud, it's not a SaaS product or a tool or something we're selling, it's a community. And what we're trying to do is make data assets within the industry and information and knowledge accessible for everybody. And there's a website that goes for it, theproptechcloud.com, where all the knowledge and content's there. And we also aggregate data sets, but then we link on to a tool called Snowflake. So for those unaware what Snowflake is, it's a data cloud platform. You may think of it as like a database or a data warehouse, but it's much broader than that. You can build databases, data lakes, data warehouses there, but there's a marketplace for exchanging data, and that marketplace has a lot of the metadata that we require to make informed decisions about data. So Data Army's teamed up with Snowflake on this initiative. We're focusing mainly here in Australia and New Zealand at the moment, but with a view to go much broader than that. And we're taking all the information and knowledge that we've sort of built over the last decade of working with property data and trying to make it available for everybody. We often go into businesses and build solutions, and it's great, but we spend a lot of the time on training and knowledge sharing. So rather than repeating that work everywhere, we're trying to make it centralized and make it repeatable for everybody. So if we sort of touch back on why or how the Proptech Cloud feeds into some of those early sort of pillars of data democratization around understanding tools and culture, we're sort of playing around this understanding and tools component. The Snowflake's bringing the tools which make accessibility quite easy and in a single platform, in a single format. And you have other providers putting tools and making tools and data available there. And then we're bringing the understanding and the training through the Proptech Cloud website and events, etc. So you can find out more information there. We're going to look to host another webinar sometime next year, and we'll talk about how we can enable collaborations on the marketplace in Snowflake and between different organizations within industry. And I hope you can all join us for that one. Any questions we want to cover off?
I've got a couple of questions, Michael, if that's okay.
Definitely.
The first question I've got is, does data democratization by default mean free data, or what's that relationship between the commoditization? How would that work?
No, I don't think it means free data at all. I mean, I think everyone realizes that there's commercial value to data, and data can be expensive to work with. And I think most people accept that there can be reimbursement for it. It's about how you make that accessible. So there's going to be a natural cost associated with data, but if you layer on an additional cost in like the way you provide that data or limiting the information, it's an additional cost for some organizations that doesn't exist for others. If you have a team of like 100 data engineers, data analysts, then consuming data is going to be easy. If you're a small startup, it's not going to be so easy. So it's not around free, it's just around the mechanisms that you make that available and the information you make available that goes along with it. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I think it's about, data should always be priced to value. And I think one of the things that my data team at Ecologic is really passionate about is an environment that allows people to experiment, test their idea in a safe and kind of compliant, small scale way with their data, like, buying packets of data, test validate your idea before you have to, do a 12-month contract for, data pipeline from, a particular packet or whatever. And so I think, there are ways around accessing data for the right use case in the right kind of amount, but it shouldn't be free because it's bloody expensive, isn't it, Michael? And really, really hard to get data into to a point. And that analogy I used before about the fuel in the car is really important. Like the fuel that you buy, that you have to understand there is a refinery process that goes into data before you can access it, and that costs money. And as Michael said, you might need the whatever it is, the 91 ethanol. I've started down this car track forgetting I'm a girl, and now I'm stuck. I'm committed. But you might be getting that, the cheap, dodgy petrol that's not good, or you might get the,
ethanol says ethanol.
Ethanol, okay. But then you might get the, super premium one, or you might have all your own capabilities and charge your own electric car in your garage. And so how you ingest data for what use case, how often, and there is economics to it, but it's important to understand that, if it was free and not to value, I think you'd end up in the junkyard with a whole bunch of really useless data, creating noise and misinformation and fake news, and you'd have the Twitter, of business in terms of the kind of quality of information if it was free.
Yeah, and that happens to some extent today in the market. So it's navigating those, and that's what we're trying to assist with, and working with Snowflake as well. There's a lot of validation on data suppliers and data sets, which is an important aspect.
Well, I'll just ask if anyone's got any questions, maybe pop them into the Q&A rather than chat. That might be working a little bit better. I do have another one though. Do you guys think, what is the role of, how big an issue is this that you see at the moment in the adoption of Proptech, this whole issue of data around, of trusting the data versus trusting the tools, and the link between them? Apologies for the background.
Yeah, I think it is. Sorry, go Sarah.
It was interesting. I've seen that evolve over the last 7 years in terms of Proptechs and with our customers, and where we started with Reader. In early days, there was no conversation. We were like, yeah, we just ingest all of your data into our system and process it, blah, blah, blah. And, I thought people would have more questions, and maybe they liked me, I don't know, but they just signed and we did it. And we tried to, we put a lot of effort into kind of plain English understanding of that sort of thing. But more and more, what are you doing with my data? Do you sell my data? All of these questions are coming up. And I think that's good. I think that's a good thing because it is their data. And you need to be careful about who you license your data to and for what purpose. And that's that democratization and empowerment piece that we're talking about, not just in the data that you ingest and buy, but also the data that flows out from what you're doing. And so, yeah, I've definitely seen an evolution in that. And I think the trust actors that are, that are kind of like Michael, I would consider a very strong trust actor in this field. He gets it. He's passionate about education. And I think people love working with people that believe in democratization, in paying for license of data, as opposed to, kind of that data oligarch scenario where the money and the data is flowing up, and there's that, that kind of structural access that is rationalized by the economics of it.
The Proptechs that sort of invest in systems internally to build trust with customers and partners are generally the ones that have a smoother process. The people that don't sort of have those things in place, it seems like it's a lot more difficult doing data exchanges and data partnerships with people, because you just don't build the trust initially. There's this thing of give us the data and then we'll trust, and you can trust us, we'll do the right thing, versus we'll demonstrate trust or build trust.
So look, if anyone's got any questions, pop them into the Q&A. I've got another question around, we've talked about the need for model rules and guidelines, and we've got the Proptech Cloud to sort of, I guess, start to kick that off. But what else should we be doing as an industry to collaborate around this creation of model rules and guidelines?
I think standards, like a standard data model to some extent would go a long way, because I think the same data points are referred to in lots of different ways with different quality, and there's no sort of standards in place. If you look at a lot of like more mature industries like accounting and engineering and things, there's standards that people sort of work towards. I feel like in the Proptech space, we're not quite evolved there, or there might be like subsections like in the construction and development side, or maybe on the real estate, like in the sales and listing side. But there's no sort of industry standard across. And I think for me, I think that's an area over the next couple of years that we would like to be part of developing, but I hope the general industry sort of adopts as well.
Yeah, I kind of had the same answer in terms of like interchangeable data exchange formats would make all of the systems a lot easier to talk to, and would, I think, exponentially lift the value that the ecosystem collectively can provide. Because the problem is that like in order for real estate agents to differentiate, they build their service design through a stack of systems that deliver, workflow. And sorry for the kind of esoteric audience that is not stuck in residential real estate like I am, but I think for most professional service industries, you'll choose between different CRM providers, different property management providers, different proposal software, different graphic design, different MarTech platforms. I've got a different email newsletter provider, and whatever your particular stack is, that's how you do business. And because technology drives workflow, it's very difficult to differentiate this business from that business, because a lot of that workflow is managed by software. But the problem, the means of differentiation is kind of adopting these different tools that do things differently that give you an edge. However, as these tools don't talk to each other, what you end up with is fractured intelligence, a completely fragmented view of your customer and what they want and how they're working with your business. And so for all of these kind of like niche Proptechs to lift, with this, we need the Lego system, right? to allow people to build that stack in a way that feels right for them and their business. So 100%. But what I was talking about before in terms of model rules is like there is very little from government in terms of guidelines, like development guidelines, or like a horizon view on how they will regulate consumer data. Like more and more is coming, particularly in relation to how it feeds into AI, and it seems like innovation has to be spelt with AI these days. So I think more and more it's coming, and we're talking with government about risk frameworks and things like that aligned to kind of the European Union example. However, it's not here and it's not coming tomorrow. So what do you do? What do you do between now and regulation? And I think some kind of model guardrails from, government have digital agency. They lead in this space and want to. So I think some guardrails and guidance would bring a lot of confidence into the the Proptech ecosystem. If you're going to chuck a couple of $1 million at something, you want to make sure it's not going to be illegal in a couple of years.
Yeah, and I think that's where, my true belief, I don't think we're going to see, government tends to be quite slow adapting to these technology things. I think it's going to be an industry movement, to be honest. I think the industry has to collectively come together and realize there's a greater good and there's a greater business opportunity through collaboration.
Yeah, I agree.
Awesome. Well, look, guys, I think we could talk about this for ages, and I'm certainly going to get on to both of you after this webinar and talk about how we actually do come up with an industry standard around, and some model guidelines and rules in this space. But thank you both so much for your time today. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation, and yeah, thanks so much. It's been great to have you on our very first Proptech Spotlight.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So,
And a very big thanks to Data Army for sponsoring it and making it possible. Just to finish off, everybody, it'd be great if you're in town in Sydney on the 30th of November. We have got our AGM on at the Stone and Chalk Scale Up Hub, the one in Pitt Street, not the one in Wynyard. I'd love to see you there. Come and have a beer with us before Christmas. Or if you can't make it, but you're interstate and you'd like to jump online and vote at the AGM, please jump onto Eventbrite and book your free spot. So look, thank you again, Dr. Sarah Bowell. Thank you, Michael Ogilvie. Thank you very much to Data Army. It's been a great conversation, and we look forward to having some more spotlights, especially on data in the new year.